The first thing to tear was her skin. She didn't feel it. The night was too loud inside her chest, her breath too fast to let the pain in. Every branch that scratched her arms was a question she couldn't answer. Every stone under her bare feet was a memory she refused to carry any longer. Her thin, white nightdress clung to her like a soaked flag. No longer innocent, no longer anything but a witness to what she was running from. Her name was Ryan. And she ran. The forest behind the Valdivieso ranch was cold and unfamiliar, the way betrayal always is. But she didn't slow down. She couldn't. The echo of her father's voice chased her through the trees, each word a whip at her back. You will do this for the family. As if she were a coin. As if she were a cattle tag. As if she were never his daughter to begin with. The moon hung low and swollen above the trees, a silent silver eye watching her stumble across a frozen creek. Her legs gave out for just a second. She hit the ground hard enough to tear open her knee, the shock of icy water soaking her to the bone. Still, she didn't stop. She didn't have a plan. She only had an image. An old shepherd who lived alone by the cliffs near Verica. A man whispered about in the kitchens by maids who pitied her. A man with no wife, no visitors, and no questions. Some called him a ghost. Some called him a wild saint. All she knew was that he wasn't her father, and that was enough. By the time her body finally gave out, she had been moving for hours. Her lungs burned. Her feet had split open in 3 places. Her dress was in tatters, stained with mud and something darker she refused to name. When she fell the last time, it wasn't dramatic. There was no gasp, no final scream. Just a soft, wet thud as she landed among ferns and damp moss. She could still breathe. That was the problem. Each breath was a reminder that she wasn't dead yet, and that meant someone could still drag her back. She opened her mouth. A whisper escaped. Please. And then she heard a snap. Not her bones. It was the sound of branches close by. She couldn't lift her head. Her vision blurred, dizzy with cold and exhaustion. But she felt it, a presence. The wet breath of an animal sniffed at her hand. A low grunt, a shuffle of paws. A dog. No, 2 of them. Her fingers twitched in the cold dirt. Then she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate. Someone was approaching, their heavy boots not rushing, not hunting, just coming. A shadow fell over her, and then it paused. She could hear him breathing, a steady rhythm, not ragged, not afraid. He knelt beside her. She could see the shape of him now, broad and bearded, the kind of man the world forgets. But the mountain remembers. He didn't touch her. He didn't speak. He just looked. She wanted to say something, to plead, but her throat held only gravel and ice. So she closed her eyes, giving up. And that was when he lifted her. Not like a weight to be carried, but like something sacred. The cabin smelled of cedar smoke and old wool. She didn't remember how they got there. She only remembered the feel of arms that didn't shake, of breath that didn't demand anything from her, of a silence that held her like a blanket. When she woke, she was wrapped in thick wool, her feet cleaned and bandaged. A fire cracked gently in the hearth, throwing dancing shadows on the rough wooden walls. Her body hurt in places she hadn't noticed before, but it was a real hurt. It was the kind of pain that says, "You've survived." She blinked. There was a carved wooden bowl by her side. Inside, steam curled above a milky tea with tiny green flecks floating on the surface. The scent of wild mint, sharp and earthy, climbed into her nose and settled somewhere deep behind her ribs. She sat up slowly, carefully. The cabin was quiet, just the fire, just her own breath, and the man. He sat near the door, his legs crossed, carving something with a small, sharp knife into a block of pine. He didn't look up, but she knew he was watching. He knew she was awake. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry and cracked. "You don't have to," he said. His voice was low, like the sound of boots on fresh snow. Calm. No accent from the villages below. He offered no name. "I'm not staying," she said. The words came out like a cough. He nodded once, as if to say, "You don't have to." But he added nothing more. Later that night, she couldn't sleep. It wasn't the pain, and it wasn't the fear. It was something stranger. It was the absence of being hunted. The dogs lay near the fire, great, shaggy beasts. One of them, with brown eyes and long, floppy ears, lifted its head to watch her, then lowered it again with a soft sigh. The man had left food for her. A piece of bread, a slice of cheese. He hadn't asked for her story. He hadn't even asked for her name. And that scared her more than anything else, because if she wasn't someone's daughter or someone's wife-to-be, then who was she? She whispered into the darkness, to no one at all, "I don't want to be someone's debt." In the morning, the snow had started to fall, soft and thick, blanketing the world in white. She tried to stand. Her feet screamed in protest, but she did it anyway, hobbling to the hearth. A shirt was folded neatly on a bench. It was too big for her. It must have been his. A silent offering. She put it on. On the small wooden table by the window, someone had left a single, small, carved horse. No saddle, no reins. Just wild and raw wood, shaped into something that wanted to run. She picked it up, its smooth surface cool against her palm. Behind her, the cabin door creaked open. "Amaru," a young voice said. She turned. A boy stood there, maybe 10 years old. He had dark hair, dark eyes, and the ingrained caution of a fox. He looked at her with the eyes of someone who had grown up listening instead of speaking. "I'm Amaru," he said again. She held the carved horse in her hand like a shield. "Ryan," she whispered. He grinned, a sudden flash of light in the dim cabin. "He carved it for you," he said, nodding toward the empty space where the man had been sitting. "Said you looked like someone who needed something that runs." Ryan sat by the fire that night, the carved horse in her lap, the sleeves of the man's shirt rolled up past her wrists. She didn't feel warm, not yet, but she wasn't cold either. The man, Nahuel, though she didn't know his name yet, sat across the room carving again, not looking at her, not pushing her to speak. And for the first time in days, maybe in years, she didn't feel like a ghost in her own body. Tomorrow, maybe she would ask his name. But tonight, she just listened to the fire. Because sometimes, being seen without any questions is louder than any answer you could ever give. The wind carried the scent of pine and wet soil into the cabin as dawn slipped through the cracks in the shutters. Ryan sat by the hearth, the carved horse still clutched in her hand. She watched the flames dance, as if they might speak and tell her what to do next. She hadn't said another word since yesterday, not to the man, not to the boy. And they hadn't pushed her. That was the strangest part. Back home, silence was a punishment. It was something sharp, something used against you. Here it was soft, like moss under your feet. The boy, Amaru, came in with a basket full of twigs and damp kindling. He didn't say good morning. He just set the basket down and glanced at her like he was checking on a hurt animal, trying not to startle it. She watched him from the corner of her eye. He was different from the boys she'd known in the village. Those loud, sharp-edged kids who threw rocks and laughed too hard. Amaru moved quietly, not out of fear, but out of a deep understanding of the world around him. He belonged to this silence, the same way the man did. She still hadn't figured out what they were to each other. They weren't family, not in the way she understood it, but there was a closeness, a quiet bond. She could feel it in the way they moved through the same small space without ever crashing into each other. The man, Nahuel, came in from outside, brushing a fresh layer of snow from his broad shoulders. His boots thudded softly on the wooden floor. He set a stack of firewood by the door. He didn't say anything to her, but he paused before walking to the back of the cabin. A glance. That was all it was. She looked down at her bandaged feet. They still ached. Her arms were covered in scratches. But something about that glance, it wasn't pity, it wasn't a command, it was just quiet notice, made her want to sit a little straighter. Later, Amaru sat across from her by the fire, a small wooden block in his hands. He was carving something, his tongue poking from the corner of his mouth in concentration. She found herself watching his small, deft fingers. "What are you making?" she asked, finally. Her voice was still rough. He shrugged. "A fox, maybe." He didn't look up, but she saw a faint smile on his lips. She wondered how long he'd been waiting for her to speak first. "You carved the horse?" she asked. He shook his head. "Nahuel did. But he doesn't say it. He just leaves things for people to find. Like it's a secret he wants you to guess." She nodded, her eyes drifting back to the small figure beside her. "Wild," Amaru added quietly. "Unguided. Like you." He looked up then. "He doesn't talk much, but he sees everything." She turned to him, surprised by his directness. "He sees everything?" Amaru nodded once, his expression serious. "You don't need to speak to be seen." The words hit her like a blast of cold air. She looked away, blinking harder than she meant to. She had spent her entire life trying to explain herself to people who had already decided who she was. And now, here she was, silent, dirty, and broken. And these two strangers had made space for her anyway, not because they needed her for something, but simply because they'd chosen to. Later that morning, Nahuel handed her a bowl of soup. It was thick, warm, and filled with barley and herbs she didn't recognize. He didn't say, "Eat this." He didn't ask if she was hungry. He just offered it and walked away. She stared at the bowl for a long time before taking a sip. When she did, something broke loose inside her. It wasn't grief, it wasn't memory. It was just the sudden, sharp realization of how long it had been since someone had given her something with no weight attached. No questions, no bargain, no leash, just food, just warmth. She didn't finish the bowl. She covered it with a cloth and set it aside gently. She had learned too well what it meant to waste something good. In the days that followed, they fell into a kind of rhythm. Amaru would go out early to feed the chickens or collect snow to melt for water. Nahuel would take the dogs into the woods, returning by dusk with meat, kindling, or sometimes nothing at all. Ryan remained near the fire, resting, slowly learning how to exist without the constant need to run. One evening, Nahuel laid a bundle of herbs beside her and motioned toward her still bandaged feet. "Boil these," he said. 10 minutes. She nodded, waiting for him to walk away before she lifted the herbs to her nose. They smelled earthy and sharp, something like mint, but wilder. She boiled them. She soaked her feet, biting her tongue against the sting. But that night, she slept without waking. And that was the first night she dreamed. Not of her father, not of the man with cows and gold who was waiting to marry her. She dreamed of horses, of open spaces, of smoke curling from a wooden roof. She dreamed of a voice she didn't recognize, saying her name as if it meant something new. The next morning, she stepped outside. It was only a few steps, her feet still bare, wrapped in a thick shawl against the cold. But she stood on the packed snow and looked out across the white hill that curved down into the valley below. It was quiet in a way the village had never been. Not empty, just full of things that didn't need to be said. Behind her, the door creaked. Nahuel stood there, a steaming mug in his hand. He didn't ask why she was outside. She didn't offer an explanation. But something passed between them in that glance. An acknowledgement, maybe, not of their pasts, but of their place in this moment. A few hours later, Amaru asked her if she wanted to see the horses. She almost said no, but then she saw the flicker in his eyes, the way he wanted to share something that was his, and she found herself saying, "Okay." The pasture was wide, nestled between two low, sloping hills. The snow was thinner there, melting into slush. 3 horses stood near a rough wooden fence. One was old and speckled gray, the others strong and alert. Amaru pointed to each in turn. "That's Roa. That's Kometa. And that's Sanisa." She nodded. "They're not scared of you," he added. "Why would they be?" He shrugged. "Some people carry noise, even when they don't speak." She reached a hand out toward Roa, the oldest. The mare stepped forward without hesitation, resting her soft muzzle in Ryan's palm. "She likes you," Amaru said, pleased. Ryan stroked the mare's nose. "I didn't think anyone would," she murmured, so quietly she thought he wouldn't hear. He didn't make it a thing. Instead, he asked, "Do you want to ride?" She smiled, just a little. "Another day, okay?" That night, she sat by the fire again. A bowl of soup steamed in her hands. The carved horse was beside her, and across the room, Nahuel sat carving another shape, this one narrower, sleeker, almost like a bird. She didn't speak. Neither did he. But the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was the kind of silence that made room for you to exist. She looked at the carved horse again, then at Nahuel. Maybe, she thought, she didn't need to explain anything at all. The next morning, she woke to something strange. It felt like her name was being whispered on the wind. Not the name she'd been given in fear, but the one she'd almost forgotten she could claim for herself. Ryan. Outside, the wind changed direction, and far beyond the trees, someone else had begun asking questions, not in kindness, but in search. The snow had begun to melt in thin, uneven patches. Underneath, the earth exhaled its damp breath, a smell that was mossy, sweet, and ancient. Ryan stood on the cabin's small porch, a wool shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. She watched the fog lift from the treetops. In the distance, the peak of Villarica glowed faintly in the morning sun, the smoke from its crater curling into the sky like a warning, or maybe a promise. She didn't know which it was yet. Amaru stood beside her, chewing on a twig like he thought it made him look older. His eyes scanned the horizon, just like Nahuel's did, watching for signs the rest of the world had forgotten how to read. "I've never been this far from the village," she said softly. He shrugged. "I've never been anywhere else." They stood in silence for a long moment. Then they heard the sound of footsteps behind them. They were slow, dragging, but deliberate. Ryan turned. The man coming up the path didn't move like someone young. His spine was bent forward, his head low, and his eyes were covered in a cloth of faded red. But he walked with a strange purpose, led only by a gnarled wooden staff and a dog that looked older than memory itself. Nahuel was already at the edge of the path, watching the figure without any sign of alarm. "Viejo Chame," Amaru whispered. The old man. Ryan looked between them. "Who is he?" "Someone who sees things," the boy answered simply. The old man stopped at the porch. His face was weathered like split bark. His eyes were hidden, but his presence filled the space like a warm tide. He lifted his head toward Ryan. "You've been running," he said. It wasn't a question. Her throat tightened. "Not anymore." He nodded once, then sniffed the air. "You've been bleeding, not just the skin." Ryan didn't answer. She didn't need to. Viejo turned his covered face toward Nahuel. "You picked up something fragile." "I picked up someone alive," Nahuel replied, his voice even. The old man chuckled, a slow, rasping sound. "That's what I said." He stayed for the day. He wasn't a guest, not really a visitor. He was more like a memory that had wandered back in from the woods. Ryan watched him work beside the fire, his long, gnarled fingers dancing over bundles of herbs as if they were old friends. He crushed leaves in a stone mortar and hummed songs that had no words. "She needs more than blankets," he said once, not to anyone in particular. "What is that?" she asked, pointing to a bitter-smelling root he was shaving into thin slices. "Memory," he replied, "but it tastes like earth and regret." Later, as twilight painted the inside of the cabin gold and gray, he asked her, "What do you carry?" Ryan looked up from where she was stitching the hem of one of Amaru's shirts. She held his gaze, or where she imagined his gaze would be, until her fingers stilled. "I carry the things no one wanted to hear." He smiled. It wasn't a kind smile, or a pitying one. It was a knowing one. Even silence has a name. The words struck something deep inside her, not like a blade, but like a bell, low, steady, and impossible to ignore. That night she dreamed again, not of horses or wind. She dreamed of a child with small hands, and a voice calling her by a name she didn't recognize, yet knew in her bones. She woke just before dawn, her hands clenched in the blanket, her breath tight in her chest. The next day, Viejo Chame sat outside on a low stool, surrounded by pine cones and dried berries. His old dog lay across his feet, snoring softly in the weak sun. Ryan joined him, sitting on a log nearby. He didn't acknowledge her at first, just kept tying herbs into tiny bundles with strips of reed. "Do you know what they're saying down the mountain?" she asked. He didn't stop working. "They're saying what they always say, that the woman doesn't belong, that the man is cursed, that the boy will grow up strange." She glanced at him. "And you?" "I say the mountain doesn't concern itself with what the moss thinks." She let out a breath that was nearly a laugh. He added, "People don't like what they can't name. If you don't fit in their jar, they call you dangerous." "I've been called worse, and you will be," he said calmly. "But you'll survive it." Amaru appeared at her elbow later, tugging at her sleeve. "Come on," he said, his eyes bright. "Roa had her foal." She followed him out to the pasture. The old mare was lying on her side, breathing heavily. At her flank, a small, shivering mass of brown and white wobbled against the straw. Ryan crouched beside it, her hands instinctively reaching out. "Easy," Nahuel said from behind her. She didn't turn. She just murmured softly as she guided the newborn closer to its mother. It was shaking, slick with birth and newness, but it was alive. So alive. "She'll stand," Nahuel said quietly. "Give her time." Ryan brushed a strand of hair from her face with the back of her wrist. "No one ever gave me time." He crouched beside her, not too close, but not too far. "You have it now." That evening, she helped prepare dinner for the first time. Her hands fumbled at first, but the rhythm of chopping vegetables came back to her like it had just been waiting. Viejo Chame sat by the fire, sipping tea from a chipped cup. "You don't plan to leave," he said. It wasn't a question. Ryan paused, then shook her head. "No." "Good," he said. "This place remembers who stays." Then he rose, gathered his herbs, and left as quietly as he'd come. No farewell, just presence, and then absence. But before he passed through the door, he turned his bandaged head toward her one last time. "The wind will change soon," he said. "Not all who walk toward you come with teeth, but some do." She watched him disappear into the trees, the old dog padding silently beside him. Nahuel came to stand next to her in the doorway. She looked up at him. Who was he, really? He shrugged. "A reminder." She nodded. "Of what?" Nahuel didn't answer, but that night when she returned to her blanket, she found a small, woven charm placed near her pillow. It smelled of sage and soil. She held it to her chest. For the first time in a long time, she believed she might belong to something not built from fear. The wind shifted during the night. When Ryan woke, the cabin felt colder, not from the fire, but from something in the air. A change, a current. Down in the valley, a merchant passed through the tavern and whispered something careless over a mug of wine. "I saw her," he said. "The girl from Valdivieso. She's living up the mountain now, with him." And like dry leaves before a storm, the rumors began to rustle. The snow had thinned and the mud had returned. That's how she knew time was moving again. The mountain measured seasons not with clocks or calendars, but with the weight of wet soil under your boots. Ryan stood at the edge of the field, watching Cometa graze near the fence line. Behind her, Amaru was hollering from the chicken coop, arguing with a hen that refused to give up her eggs. Nahuel was chopping firewood, each strike steady and precise, a rhythm that shaped the air around him. Everything here moved in silence or small laughter. She liked that. It was honest. But she had begun to feel a tension in her bones, like the stillness before a storm. Her body remembered something her mind didn't want to say aloud. It started with a knock, not a polite knock, not a stranger's call. It was a fist, heavy and hard, meant to be heard. Nahuel opened the door slowly. Outside stood a man with leather gloves and a city jacket still damp from the mist. His horse was tethered behind him. His face had a polished coldness, the look of someone who never worked the land but thought he owned it. Ryan saw him and froze. He saw her too, his mouth curled into a smirk. "There she is," he said. Nahuel didn't move. "You're trespassing." The man grinned, tilting his head like he had all the time in the world. "I'm a messenger, just passing something along." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded letter sealed with red wax. It was too clean, too official for this place. "For the lady," he said. He dropped it in the dirt and left without waiting for an answer. Ryan stared at the letter as if it might bite. She didn't touch it for hours. Later, inside, she sat at the table with the letter unopened in front of her. Amaru peeked in but didn't speak. Nahuel sat near the fire, not watching her, but listening to her silence. Finally, she spoke. "He's coming." Nahuel looked up. "My father," she clarified. "Not alone. He'll bring men, horses, the kind who don't ask, they take." Nahuel's face didn't change. "Let him come." She shook her head. "You don't understand." He stood and walked to the door, opening it wide. He let the cold wind sweep through the room before turning back to her. "I didn't get lost," she said, her voice cracking. "I ran." "I know," he said simply. "You ran toward life. That's not a sin." She looked down at her hands, her knuckles white. "He'll say I was taken, that you manipulated me, that I'm weak." Nahuel leaned against the doorframe. "What do you say?" She met his gaze, the firelight dancing in her tired eyes. "I say I chose this." That night, the three of them sat around the fire as they often did. But the warmth didn't settle the way it used to. Something in the air had changed. It wasn't just the weather. It was something closer. Nahuel handed her a cup of tea. Their fingers brushed. This time she didn't pull away. "I don't want to leave," she whispered. "You won't." She waited. "Even if it means—" "I said, you won't." It was a vow. But it didn't come with promises. It came with a certainty, and that was heavier. Over the next 2 days, Ryan moved differently. She helped Nahuel patch holes in the barn wall. She gathered herbs with Amaru and started labeling jars in neat charcoal lines. She cooked stew and salted meat. She sewed a tear in Nahuel's shirt without him asking. None of it was dramatic, but every action was hers. One night, as she passed him the folded shirt, he took it, but didn't let go of her hand. His fingers were rough against hers, solid, real. You don't owe me, she said. I know. Still, he held her hand one breath longer before releasing it. Later, she lay awake, staring at the beams above her bed. She thought of how many times she'd been told who she was supposed to be. A daughter, a wife, a tool. Here. No one had told her anything. She'd had to start telling herself, and that terrified her more than any letter. By the third day, word had reached the town. In the tavern, men whispered over their drinks. Some pitied the girl, some blamed the man, but all of them had an opinion. She was promised, one said, and that mountain savage stole her. Maybe she wanted to be stolen, said another. The barkeep only grunted. No one goes up there unless they mean to. The storm came on the fourth day, not weather. It was the sound of hoofbeats. 5 riders, their coats trimmed with gold, their rifles visible. They weren't hunting. They weren't hiding. They were coming like they were owed something. Ryan saw them before they reached the fence. She didn't run. Nahuel stepped out onto the porch, a rifle slung across his back but not drawn. He stood in the melting snow, his hands loose at his sides, just waiting. The man in front, a slick-haired rider with expensive boots, smirked as he dismounted. You must be Nahuel. I don't answer to you. The rider laughed. You'll answer to the law. That girl inside belongs to Don Rafael Valdivieso. She's not a goat. You don't own her. The man tilted his head. She's a minor, promised in marriage. You've interfered. That's abduction. Nahuel didn't flinch. She's here of her own will. She's confused. You'll see. A few hours on a horse will remind her of her duty. From behind Nahuel, Ryan stepped out into the snow. The rider turned, triumphant. There you are. Come now. Be reasonable. She walked until she stood beside Nahuel. Her voice was quiet, but it was clear. No. He blinked. Ryan, you don't understand. I said no. He took a step forward. Nahuel shifted his weight. The rider paused, measured the man before him. You'd risk bloodshed for this? Nahuel's voice was colder than the mountain wind. Then bring your coffins, too. Silence fell like a hammer. The rider held his gaze, but something in Nahuel's utter stillness, not a threat but a certainty, spoke louder than any steel. Finally, the man turned back to his horse. This isn't over. Nahuel said nothing. They rode off, leaving the snow churned and broken behind them. That night, no one spoke at dinner. Not out of fear, but because something had been decided. Ryan sat beside Nahuel, not touching, just there. And when the fire dimmed and the stars stretched over the cabin like a quilt of silence, she laid her hand over his on the rough wooden table. He didn't move, but his thumb curled around hers. At sunrise, a bird brought something tied to its leg. A second letter. This one was different. No wax, no threats, just a familiar scroll and 6 words. You're not his blood. You never were. The sun had barely crested the ridge when Ryan unfolded the letter. Her fingers were stiff with the morning frost. Amaru had found it tied to the leg of a pigeon that fluttered into the barn as if it had traveled through smoke to get there. There was no seal, no name, just those 6 words. You're not his blood. You never were. Her breath caught in her throat, sharp and thin, like the air before lightning strikes. She read it again, and then a third time, hoping the words would shift, soften, change into something else. They didn't. Nahuel watched her from the porch. She stood in the open yard, the letter hanging from her fingers, her lips moving without making a sound. She didn't cry. But she didn't come back inside, either. He let her be. That was the difference between this place and everything she had known before. Here, pain didn't need permission to exist. By mid-morning, she was gone. Not far. Just to the edge of the woods where the light fell in golden shafts through the evergreens. She sat on a boulder worn smooth by years of rain and snow and rested her forehead against her knees. Footsteps approached, soft, not Nahuel's. Amaru sat beside her and handed her a piece of bread wrapped in a cloth. "You left before breakfast," he mumbled. She took it but didn't eat. "Did he hurt you?" the boy asked. She shook her head. "Then why do you look like you can't breathe?" she whispered. "Because I don't know who I am anymore." Amaru was quiet. Then, in a voice too small for the cold air around them, he said, "I don't know who my mother was, but I still wake up, I still laugh sometimes, I still belong." She looked at him, at his serious old eyes. "You think we get to belong? Even when we come from nothing?" He shrugged. "Nahuel says the land doesn't care who planted you, only how you grow." That night she told Nahuel the truth, or at least the part she could manage to say out loud. "I'm not his daughter," she said. "Not by blood." Nahuel didn't speak right away. He poured water into a kettle and placed it over the fire. She waited. Finally he spoke. "Do you feel free?" "I don't know." "You don't sound angry." "I don't know how to be angry at a lie I wanted to believe." Nahuel passed her a steaming cup. "I was 13, he said, when I found out my brother wasn't my brother." Ryan glanced at him, startled. "He was my uncle's child, raised as my own. He never knew. Still doesn't." She searched his face for bitterness, for resentment. She found none. He said simply, "You are who you are becoming." Days passed, but something inside her had shifted. The ground beneath her identity, what little she had cracked. She didn't fall. But she changed how she walked. She started keeping a journal, not long entries, just words, wind, bread, free, almost. She tied back her hair each morning like it was a kind of armor. She wore the boots Nahuel had fixed for her. She cooked dinner even when no one asked. She built things with her hands. She fixed a leaking corner of the roof. She darned socks. She pickled carrots. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait to be told. She just did. Because if she didn't come from someone, then maybe she could come from herself. Nahuel noticed the changes but never commented on them. He just moved around her like gravity. Silent, steady, always present. Amaru started following her like a shadow with a smile. Sometimes she would find small things left on her cot. A feather, a smooth river stone, a seashell from a place nowhere near these mountains. One evening she found a wooden plank set outside the barn, with the rough outline of something carved into it. She asked Amaru what it was. He shrugged, grinning. "He's building something." "What?" "Don't know. But he only builds for people who stay." She touched the edge of the raw wood. Maybe it was a shed, maybe a fence, or maybe she dared to hope it was a future. It was early spring when the sickness came, not an illness. It was a nausea that didn't pass, a heaviness in her chest, a strange new rhythm in her own body. She sat alone in the dark of the stable, whispering to the horses just to hear her own voice. And then it came to her. Not in panic, but in certainty. She was pregnant. It wasn't a pregnancy that came from pain or fear. It came from something gentle. A night spent beside someone who never asked for her name, only offered his warmth. A child. Her hand moved to her belly. It didn't feel like terror. It felt like an anchor. She told Nahuel that night. They were sitting by the fire. Amaru had already gone to sleep, curled up under a blanket that smelled of hay and pine. "I think," she said, her voice shaking just a little, "I'm carrying." Nahuel looked at her. His eyes weren't wide, not alarmed. They were just still. "Are you afraid?" he asked. She thought for a long time. "No," he nodded. "You don't have to do anything," she added quickly. "You didn't ask for this. I didn't plan it. I'm not asking." Nahuel stood, walked to the door, and opened it. For a second, she thought he was leaving. Then he stepped outside, came back in carrying a plank of wood and laid it on the table. She stared. It was the start of a crib. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. They didn't marry. There was no priest, no paper, but there was a meal shared in silence. A song hummed low by the fire. A hand held across a pillow in the dark. And that night, Ryan whispered to the small life inside her, "You are not born from a bargain. You are not someone's escape. You are the beginning." In the weeks that followed, she began building a garden, digging into the earth with her bare hands, placing seeds like they were hopes with roots. Amaru painted a mural on the inside of the barn wall, badly, but with joy. Nahuel added insulation to the roof, fixed the windows, and started building a second room onto the cabin. When she asked why, he only said, "You'll need space." One night, she lay in Nahuel's arms, the fire burning low. The baby hadn't kicked yet, but she knew it would soon. She said, "This was never supposed to happen." Nahuel answered, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "Then let's stop living like we were supposed to." Outside, under the black velvet of the sky, the wind carried the scent of soil and ash. And in a village far below, a woman with the same eyes as Ryan placed another letter into an envelope. This one began, "You were never meant to belong to him, but I think you belong to me in a different way." The letter arrived wrapped in oilcloth, tied with a strand of blue thread. It was deliberate, careful, and completely unfamiliar. Amaru had found it tucked inside the fence gate that morning, balanced perfectly, as if it had walked there on its own. Ryan unfolded it slowly, her fingers already trembling before she read a single word. Nahuel watched her from the firewood pile, sensing that the ground beneath her had shifted again. The handwriting was neat, elegant, too elegant for the kind of news it carried. "You were never meant to belong to him, but I think you belong to me in a different way." She sat on the steps, reading it over and over. The name at the bottom wasn't just ink. It was weight, Delea, her father's sister, not the man who raised her. Her mother's sister, someone she didn't remember, but someone who remembered her. She didn't realize how long she'd been staring at the paper until Nahuel knelt beside her, his calloused hand hovering near hers. "Talk to me," he said gently. "She's my aunt," Ryan said. "My real aunt. My birth mother's sister." "Is that what the letter says?" "She says she's been looking for me since I was a baby. She says Raphael, the man who raised me, took me after my mother died, told everyone I was his." "And she waited this long to send a letter?" Ryan looked at him, her eyes pleading for him to believe. "She says she tried. She said he burned every message, moved me, hid me." Nahuel didn't answer right away. He didn't doubt her, but he'd learned that even the truth could come with splinters. "She wants to meet," Ryan added. "She says she lives in Puerto Fue now, says it's quiet there, safe." "Do you believe her?" Ryan folded the letter slowly. "I don't know, but I want to." That night, sleep didn't come easy. She lay beside Nahuel, the baby growing between them like a small shared secret. The wind howled outside, but her mind was louder. She had found a home, a rhythm, a man who never asked for her past and loved her anyway. But there was still a hole in her story, a hole shaped like a woman she'd never met and a truth she'd never been told. In the dark, she whispered, "What if I go? And it's all a lie?" Nahuel didn't open his eyes. He just reached over and rested a hand on her belly. "Then you'll come back," he said, "and we'll start again." She closed her eyes. They made a plan. She would ride down to Puerto Fui alone. Nahuel offered to come, but she shook her head. "If it's a trap, I don't want them seeing you. And if it's not, I need to do this by myself." It was the same kind of strength she'd used when she ran through the forest, barefoot and bleeding. But now it was sharper, steadier. She wasn't running from something. She was riding toward it. Amaru helped her pack a satchel, a blanket, a knife, some food and water. He snuck in the small carved wooden fox he'd made without telling her. She found it hours later, hidden under a bundle of dried apples. Nahuel saddled Cometa. He checked the straps twice, then once more after that. He didn't say goodbye. He just touched her face, as if she were still a broken girl he'd found in the woods, someone he could keep safe with just his hands. "Come back whole," he said. "No one gets to finish the story for you." The ride to Puerto Fue took a day and a half. The trail was rough in places, but the forest seemed to make space for her, as if it remembered the girl who had once escaped through its dark embrace. When she arrived, she expected a village like the one she'd grown up in, small, gossip-ridden, tight. But Puerto Fue was quieter, pine-heavy and misty. She asked for Delea at the general store. The clerk smiled. "You mean the woman with the green scarf? She works at the bakery at the end of the road, lives above it." Ryan walked there slowly, her boots muddy, her legs aching, her pulse loud in her ears. She didn't knock. She stood in the doorway, looking at a woman through the bakery window. She had short gray-streaked hair and hands dusted in flour. She was laughing with a young girl who might have been her apprentice, or her daughter. Ryan's legs refused to move, but her eyes didn't blink. The woman turned, saw her, and froze. Her mouth opened, then closed. She stepped outside without wiping the flour from her hands and just stood there. They stared at each other for a long, silent moment. Then Delea whispered, "You have your mother's jaw." Ryan swallowed. "She was softer than me," Delea continued, her voice thick with emotion. "But stronger, too. She'd be proud of you." "Did she name me?" Delea nodded, a tear tracing a path through the flour on her cheek. "Ryan. She said it meant flower that blooms after fire." Ryan's chest cracked open with those words. It wasn't pain. It wasn't grief. It was recognition. Delea motioned inside. "Come," she said. "You must be hungry." They talked through the evening, over bread and soup and warmth. The stories came in pieces. Delea didn't press. She didn't pretend to have all the answers. She admitted to trying and failing to find her niece for years. "I didn't want to marry Raphael," she said, her voice low. "Your mother didn't either. He forced her. When she died giving birth to you, he just took you, said it was his right. I screamed. I fought. No one would listen." Ryan asked the question that had been burning in her mind. "Why now?" Delea smiled sadly. "Because I heard a whisper in the market. A merchant said a girl with your mother's fire was living up on the mountain with a man who didn't try to own her. I knew it had to be you." That night, Ryan slept in a real bed, layered with quilts that smelled of cinnamon and old stories. She dreamed of her mother's voice, low and kind, calling her by a name that had waited too long to be real. In the morning, she helped knead dough. Her hands found the rhythm quickly. Delea watched her, her eyes soft. "You have her hands, too," she said. Ryan didn't stay long. 2 nights, that was all. It was enough to stitch a new truth to old wounds, enough to choose, finally, what to carry and what to leave behind. Before she left, Delea pressed a worn necklace into her palm. A simple, thin, silver circle. "She wore this every day," Delea said. "It was the only thing she got to keep when she married him." Ryan fastened it around her neck. It didn't feel like weight. It felt like a tether, back to something that came before the fire. She returned home at dusk, riding into the clearing just as Nahuel was splitting firewood and Amaru was running to meet her. She dismounted slowly. Her eyes met Nahuel's across the yard, and for the first time in her life, She said the words without trembling. I know where I come from, but I choose where I stay. That night, thunder rolled in the distance. It wasn't weather. It was the sound of riders moving through the valley. Among them, a man with the same eyes as Ryan and a ledger in his coat. He wasn't looking for reconciliation. He was coming to make a claim. They came at dawn, not like thieves in the night, but like officials. 8 riders, their boots clean, their beards trimmed, their silence practiced. They were the kind of men who didn't raise dust when they traveled, only suspicion. Their coats were stitched with gold thread, but their eyes were dull and gray, like slate, like debt, like promises made on paper. Ryan saw them before the others. She was tending to her small garden when the sound of hooves pulled her gaze toward the trail. It wasn't a gallop, not a threat. It was a steady, entitled rhythm. She stood up slowly, her hands still dirty with soil, and pressed one hand to her belly. The baby kicked, a sharp jab, almost as if it knew something had shifted in the wind. Amaru appeared beside her. Who are they? She didn't answer. Nahuel stepped out of the barn, his axe still in his hand. He saw them too, and in that instant, Ryan saw his jaw tighten, not with fear, with memory. They're from the Registro de Propiedad, he muttered. Land registry? She asked. Nahuel nodded. And worse, they don't just count acres, they count people. The leader of the riders was a man named Inspector Cortez. His name matched his posture, sharp, cutting. He dismounted with a clipboard in one hand and a revolver on his hip. He didn't bother with greetings. I'm here on behalf of Don Rafael Valdivieso. Ryan's stomach twisted into a knot. You are occupying land that was, until recently, under dispute, Cortez announced. He has made a claim. Says the man known as Nahuel is harboring property that rightfully belongs to him. Nahuel stepped forward, his voice calm. There's no property here, just lives. Cortez raised an eyebrow. That girl was promised, legally bound. The child she carries is mine, Ryan said, her voice ringing out. The men turned to look at her. She stepped forward, her chin high. The child is mine, and I am not property. Cortez just clicked his pen against the clipboard. You can say that. It doesn't make it law. Nahuel moved to stand between her and the inspector. There is no law on this land that justifies the buying or taking of a woman. Cortez smiled coldly. The law is whoever owns the ink, and Don Rafael owns a great deal of it. Ryan's blood ran hot. Then let him come himself. Cortez's eyes narrowed. He's not far. They didn't leave. They set up a camp just outside the pasture. The horses were tethered, and the men lit small fires, cooking meat as if they belonged there. Nahuel kept watch from the porch. They won't move without him, he said. And when he comes? Ryan asked. Nahuel didn't answer. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat by the hearth, the baby restless inside her, her heart louder than any storm. She whispered, What if he tries to take me? Nahuel looked at her, his voice low but ironclad. If he wants to own you, he'll have to break what made you. She swallowed. And if he does? He leaned closer, touching her face. Then he'll learn. You don't burn a fire and expect it to kneel. The next morning, Rafael came. He didn't ride a horse. He came in a cart with velvet seats and a ledger on his lap. His beard was trimmed, his boots polished, but his eyes were the same ones from every nightmare she'd ever had. Too quiet, too calculating. He stepped from the cart and walked into their clearing like he had a deed for the very soil under their feet. Ryan stood on the porch, her shoulders square. Hello, daughter, he said. I'm not your daughter. He smiled. You always were dramatic. I'm not your anything. He ignored her, turning to Nahuel. You've made her wild. I didn't make her, Nahuel said. She walked here on her own. Rafael stepped closer. I've come to resolve this peacefully. There is no peace in chains, Ryan said. I raised you. You hid me. I gave you a name. You gave me silence. He looked at her belly, his lip curling in disgust. And now you breed like them. Nahuel's hand moved to the knife on his belt, but Ryan raised her hand, a small, sharp gesture. He doesn't deserve your anger. She stepped off the porch, closer to Raphael. You know what I used to believe? She said, her voice sharp. That freedom came with distance. That if I ran far enough, you'd stop reaching. He said nothing. But I was wrong. Freedom doesn't come from running. It comes from choosing to stop. She looked him dead in the eye. And I've stopped running. Raphael smirked. Then you force my hand. He turned to the men at the camp. Seize the man. Bring the girl. Burn the rest. The riders moved. Nahuel didn't hesitate. He was at the barn door in a second, letting out a sharp whistle. 4 large dogs bounded into view, snarling, trained for this. Amaru rushed toward the house, grabbing the rifle from its pegs. Ryan snatched the heavy iron poker from the hearth. The clearing exploded into chaos, shouts, the churn of mud under boots, the splintering of wood, the barking of dogs and the cursing of men. Nahuel took down 2 of them before they even touched the porch steps. The dogs dragged one rider screaming into the pasture. Another slipped in the mud and his legs snapped with a sickening crack. Ryan stood over one with the poker raised. Tell him to call them off! The rider coughed, bleeding from his mouth. He won't, he gasped. He only understands ash. Then something strange happened. Raphael ran. He didn't fight. He didn't shout orders. He saw the tide turning, and he turned his back on it. A coward, through and through. But as he reached his cart, a single shot cracked across the valley. It came from the woods. Raphael collapsed. The riders froze. Out of the trees came a woman in a wide-brimmed hat, holding a smoking rifle. Delea. Ryan rushed to her. What? How? I followed him, Delea said, her voice steady. I heard he was coming. I thought if I couldn't protect my sister, I could at least protect her daughter. The riders dropped their weapons. Cortez knelt in the mud, his hands raised. We were just following orders. Ryan stepped forward. Then you've learned what kind of orders not to follow. They buried Raphael in the woods, with no stone to mark his name, not out of hatred, but because memory didn't owe him anything. That night, they sat around the fire again. Ryan, Nahuel, Amaru, and Delea. The house smelled of smoke and stew. The baby kicked. Someone laughed. Someone cried. Delea placed her hand over Ryan's. You were never lost, she said, just waiting to remember who you were. 2 months later, under a blood-orange sky, the baby was born. And in the hush that followed her first cry, Nahuel whispered, You don't belong to anyone, but you will change everything. The child came just after sunset. The sky burned with the last colors of the day, deep crimson, orange, the kind of light that made the world look older and wiser. The wind outside was calm, but everything inside the cabin pulsed with a quiet urgency. Ryan gripped the edge of the bed frame, her breath ragged, sweat slick on her temples. Delea stood by her side, whispering encouragement in a voice that had steadied generations. Nahuel moved like stone and water, silent, strong, present. Amaru waited outside with the horses, too nervous to sit still, too loyal to be far. The baby's cry cracked through the room like lightning. It was raw, powerful, and alive. In that moment, everything stopped. Time, breath, memory. Ryan collapsed back into the bed, her arms open, ready. Delea placed the newborn in her hands. She was tiny, warm, and angry at the cold of the new world. Ryan laughed through her tears. You have your mother's jaw, she whispered. Nahuel leaned close, brushing a single finger across the baby's cheek. His voice was barely a whisper. You don't belong to anyone, but you will change everything. They named her Kuyen, the Mapuche word for the moon, not because she was soft, but because she would grow to carry her own light into the dark. In the days that followed, the cabin changed. It grew quieter, but not with fear, with peace. The kind of silence that held meaning, the kind earned through fire and survival. Ryan healed slowly. She spent her mornings holding Kuyen to her chest, whispering stories into her tiny ears. Not fairy tales, not myths, truths. About blood, about choice, about how a woman can come from violence and still bloom without asking for permission. Delea stayed longer than she planned. She helped Nahuel build a cradle with carved stars and little wooden foxes. She didn't talk much about the past anymore. She didn't have to. She was here now. One morning, Amaru returned from the valley with word. People had started talking. Not rumors this time. Gratitude. The village healer had asked about Ryan, said the crops hadn't rotted this spring like they usually did. Said the air around the mountain felt lighter somehow. A merchant claimed he saw the girl who used to flinch at her father's name now walking through town with a baby strapped to her back and a smile like a flag. Someone else just said the land always knew what was right, even when people didn't. Months passed. The seasons shifted. Kuyen grew teeth and a laugh that could break the cold like firewood. Nahuel built her a swing from braided rope and a strong pine branch. Ryan painted flowers on the fence with leftover berry dye. Amaru carved her first toy from cherry wood and gave it to her like a knight offering a sword to his queen. They didn't call themselves a family out loud. They didn't need to. The word was in everything they did. One night, Ryan stood alone by the edge of the woods, watching the stars rise. She wore her mother's simple silver necklace now like a second skin. The past no longer clung to her like a bruise. It lived in her, but it didn't own her. She closed her eyes and spoke quietly, not to anyone in particular. Thank you for breaking me just enough to build myself honest. Behind her, Nahuel stepped into the clearing, Kuyen sleeping against his chest. She sleeps easier when you hum, he said. Ryan smiled. She's smarter than both of us. He chuckled. She'll have your stubbornness. She'll have her own. They stood there watching the wind ripple through the trees. There was no danger behind it, just movement, just life. And maybe that's what this story was always about. Not just survival, not revenge, not rebellion. It was about reclamation. A woman torn from her name who found it again in the soil. A man mistaken for a ghost who became a home. A child born from no bargain, whose first cry meant beginning. And a land that watched quietly through it all, holding every secret until it was ready to bloom. Ryan looked at Nahuel, then at the baby, then at the land stretching wide and untouched beyond the tree line. She whispered, "We are not what they made us." He nodded. "We are what we choose to keep." If this story reminded you that your past doesn't get to write your future, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what it means to you to choose your own family. Thanks for watching.